There once was an average young guy called Johnny Hustle, and he got into the whole self-improvement sphere to escape this life of mediocrity because he kept in touch with his old friends from school, and what he saw worried him. Some let themselves go. They became fat, lazy, and unmotivated because they couldn't handle this new independence of adult life and the responsibility that came along with it. Johnny felt sorry for them, but on top of his disappointment, he was scared too because he really didn't want to end up like them. But then when he looked at the other half of his classmates, it wasn't doing him any better for his self-esteem because they were thriving. They were the gifted kids who got the jobs, who had some direction in life. And when you saw their social media, it was full of these scenes of joy and prosperity. And I get it's not everything, but they were doing good overall. Now, of course, Johnny's happy for them, but the feeling's bittersweet because while they're getting ahead in life, he's stagnating and he's somewhere in between both groups in this sort of purgatory. He had nothing to show the world, and it felt like he was almost left behind. But instead of wallowing in his own sadness, Johnny Hustle did something. He took responsibility. He got into the gym, he cleaned up his diet, and he took his education more seriously. And to no surprise, it's this last thing we're focusing on. Johnny Hustle wants to understand the world a bit more and explore his own mind. So to do that, he starts reading, which is great, and eventually adds writing on top of that. And of course, you can't forget the usual self-help podcasts, articles, YouTubers, all of that stuff. It's good, but it's not good enough for him because he came from this life of mediocrity. He wants to be the best. He wants to get to the top and stay there. And what do you do in that situation? Well, it's the favorite word of every self-help guru. You optimize. To optimize his learning, Johnny would download these book summary apps and then blast through them every day. He got these new fancy AI tools to get these long, boring books and condense them into the key points. And with every single spare moment during his day, he'd make sure to fill it with an audiobook or a podcast in his ear. There was always something going on, and he used every single technique out there to cram more and more in. Despite this feeling of progress and productivity, the reality said otherwise. Because he found all these workarounds and ways to condense his learning, he got rid of the substance behind it, the stuff that matters. Those book summary apps didn't give him the time he needed to process what he was reading. All the AI summaries too were shallow and forgettable. And those podcasts, 80% of them were just background music. He didn't really pay attention to them. Johnny's intentions were great. They came from a good place. And this desire to optimize, it sounded good on paper, but in practice, it falls flat and it leads to all of these hours of education going to waste pretty much. Now that example is extreme, but the problems he faced are not really far away from what we experience sometimes. Now I was lucky enough to grow up with books, but after school I had this terrible reading slump where I stopped completely and I ended up kind of hating it for a bit. And it was only through this wave of self-improvement stuff that I rediscovered my love for it. It's quite common too, so there's a good chance you felt the same way. And like me, maybe you're also kind of getting sick of that content because a lot of it is good, don't get me wrong, but there's this irritating subgroup that pushes these kind of stupid and unrealistic approaches to learning, ones that might sound good on paper and, in this perfect world, but in practice they don't work. And the only reason they don't work is because they've never tried it themselves and they just push it onto you as a consumer. And what is the common thread with all of these hacks and tricks? Well, all of them remove friction from the act of learning. Well, so what? Friction's a bad thing. And yeah, it is, but this is not the same friction you might be thinking about. I don't mean the resistance that stops you from sitting down and getting the learning done. That's a bad thing. But I mean the friction that comes once you've started within the learning itself. Another word to describe this friction is the slowness of it, how thorough it is, and how much careful attention you're putting into it. It's choosing to read a bulky book head on instead of just reading its summary and taking the easy way out. It's willfully ignoring any of these hacks that say, yeah, bro, I'm going to supercharge your learning, because you're not. It's choosing to make notes, to reread the book, to discuss it, to think about it before moving on. That's the kind of friction I mean. Now, I love the idea of using a river to visualize this. So if you imagine, say, the Mississippi River, it's wide, it's deep, there's nothing in the way. So you get these huge volumes of water going through it with nothing to stop it. And that's the same with the content you consume. If you speed read books, burn through summaries, and multitask with these podcasts, you can consume a huge amount of information very quickly because there's nothing there to stop it. Now, I bet you can already see the cracks start to form, but let's look at the other end. Picture yourself next to a rocky stream, one that's deep in the Appalachian Mountains and quite high up. Now, it's nestled in this grove of spruce trees. The air is crisp, it's clean, it's all very picturesque, but we're focusing on the water. What do you immediately notice as different? Its flow is nothing like the Mississippi. There's rocks, there's crevices, there's bits of debris, and if you go downstream, you'll probably find waterfalls and the odd beaver dam. All of these obstacles block the water, which has to now twist and turn and barrel over it to get through. And it may look more active and violent than the Mississippi, but there's actually a much smaller volume of water. It's only a stream. When you add friction to your learning, it becomes more similar to this rocky stream. The ideas get a chance to stick around a bit and make themselves useful, rather than just flowing straight on, really fast. Just like the water, your ideas are bounced around a bit. They're dragged along and they get the chance to connect with each other. They move slowly, and that means you will slow down as well. Inevitably, you consume less content. And I'm not going to bullshit you here and say it's easier, because it's not. There's no cheating in the system. There's no getting around the effort and avoiding it. I'm okay with the slow approach because at the end of the day, it's more fulfilling. It lets you squeeze out everything an author has to offer, and you leave the pain of sloppy learning behind. And perhaps most importantly for you, the content you consume becomes a part of you. Instead of seeing books as a piece of content that you desperately have to, memorize and cling on to, it just becomes a part of who you are. It changes how you think. It changes how you act in the world. And it's almost embedded into your character. It's like what monks do. They have a lot of friction in their learning, and they spend decades going over the same scripture to almost become an embodiment of it, and to see it in a depth that no one else really can. Now, you don't have to become a monk, of course, but we can take their principles and apply it to our own learning. And the best part is, it's not like a one-size-fits-all approach. You can do it as a serious reader. You can do it if you just like a little bit of casual learning on the side. And it's all up to you to decide. So here I want to share a few tweaks that I've made to my own learning to make it, yes, slower, but also more thoughtful and meaningful. One of the best approaches is also the most obvious. So I'll get it out of the way before we can get to the juicy stuff. And it's writing. The second you put pen to paper, in this case pencil, you take control of the learning. You wake your mind up. And you're no longer this passive spectator who receives all the author's ideas. You're now an active player. Everything the author sends your way can be explored through writing. You can ask questions, you can arrange your thinking, and you can just explore what they have to say in greater detail, all by putting pen to paper. As I'm reading, I will always jot down notes, and these can be really just quick scribbles to help me think and to ask any questions or rephrase what the author has to say. And if I feel like the book deserves it, I'll go back to these ideas later on and give them a more official write-up, just to really cement the ideas down. But again, this is up to you. You can do as little as you want, you can do as much as you want. But the point is, you're adding friction through writing and understanding the ideas better. And we're not narrow-minded here. This idea is not limited to just books. If I suspect that any piece of content has something valuable to offer me, I'm going to put it aside and I'll refuse to engage with it unless I'm willing there and then to sit down and write notes. And that counts for videos, articles, even podcasts, anything. Now, it might sound excessive, but I can really testify that it's changed how I approach all media. It stops me from sitting there consuming stuff endlessly just for the sake of it. And it transforms the experience into something thoughtful and one that has intention behind it. Because there's a shitstorm of content out there that doesn't really deserve our attention. And this mindset helps you guard against that and to focus on what really matters. And when the gems of content do show up in that mess, you can take them and give them the attention they deserve. Every time you pick up a pencil, you've made the conscious decision to learn and to grow, and everything becomes mindful. I write up my notes in an app called Obsidian, and if you want to do the same, I have a video explaining that whole process. But you can really do anything. I prefer online notes because you can carry entire libraries of information in your pocket essentially, or on a computer. But at the same time, it's a bit of a shame because then you miss the feeling of pen on paper, physical notes. Now, writing on pen and paper is not only good for the aesthetics and the feeling of it, but it's actually really good for adding friction to your learning. Now, I type really slow anyway. I'm like a pensioner with that. But if you can touch type, you can probably spit out hundreds of words per minute, and that's good for output. But sometimes it's so fast that our brain can't keep up with what we're typing. But if you switch to pen and paper, you have to slow down, and your brain gets the chance to reflect more deeply. And chances are that's going to end up in a better first draft or a better retention of your notes. And the good news is you don't have to choose between both methods. You can actually do both. And that's what I do to get the best of both worlds. Like I said, I'll jot down physical notes in my first read through. And then when I finish the book, I'll give them a more formal, official and lengthy write-up online. But that's just me. And there's 100 different ways you could maybe sneak in some pen and paper writing in your own process. Or vice versa, if you already love notebooks and you want to find a way to type up more on the computer. Now, I warn you, this next approach is not casual in the slightest. It's almost going to double the time you spend with a single book. But in the past almost 2 years now I've been using it, It's so worth it. I'm not going back. Just to use an example, I finished the Orestian trilogy about 7 months ago, and this is a Greek tragic play. And despite the fact that I haven't revisited it since, I can pretty confidently talk to you about some of the main themes in it. I can talk about the characters, the context, the story. I remember all of these things pretty damn well. I don't say that to sound like a twat or to pretend I'm a professor of literature, but it's simply evidence that although this technique is really damn slow, it works. What I do is when I finish the book, I go straight back to the beginning and then work through it again. But this time I only look at where I've written notes in pencil, just to reinforce what I've learned. I've been annotating my books for ages, but within that time I kept making the same stupid mistake that made it almost a waste of time. When I got to the end of the book, I think to myself, wow, job well done. Look at me writing my books. But that was a false sense of security. I was leaving the job half finished because I would never revisit these annotations and make use of them. So they were pretty much just going to waste completely. To fix that mess, I now take a different approach, one with extra effort but huge returns. I take these rough notes and I use them to make a more detailed write-up in Obsidian online. And that gives me the chance to elaborate, to explore, and really come to terms with the ideas within the book. I mean, it makes sense because the margins are small, it's cramped, and it's a real pain in the ass to write more than a sentence each time. All of this extra discussion rewards you with understanding, the kind that no amount of memory tactics or flashcards could ever hope to achieve. And luckily it's slow, but not to the point where it's tedious. Because remember, you're skipping most of the book. You're choosing now only to focus on the parts that stood out to you, the parts that you chose to write something about. I first heard of this next approach from Jim Clare on Twitter, and he's a great writer, so do check him out. He's also a sworn enemy of hustle culture, and his advice on reading fits that perfectly. Now, contrary to what all the self-help androids like to repeat, it's okay and probably good to read fewer books, but to read them well. And when I say read a book well, a lot of that is reflection. When you've just finished a really thoughtful piece and you put it down, a lot of the value from this book comes not during the read itself, but afterwards, when you're just thinking about it. For example, I've just finished writing notes on the Oedipus plays by Sophocles, and this was heavy stuff. There was a lot to think about. There was lots of rights and wrongs to weigh up, and lots of moral dilemmas. Now, I could just jump to the next book, and that is tempting, don't get me wrong, but instead I choose to just leave it aside, and for a few days or a week, to read nothing. It's not like I'm going to sit in my room and cosplay as the thinker, or do a 5-hour meditation session, but the point is to give me some time to think about what I've just read. What would I have done in that situation? Which characters did the right thing, and which ones missed the mark? Or what does this story say about love, or family, or pride, or violence, or any of these themes that they talk about? All of these questions that come to you after you finish the book are part of a good reflection. Think of it like a digestive walk after a long meal. It gives you the time you need to grapple with the ideas and to ultimately extract more. Yes, it's slow and of course it adds friction, but at the end of that thinking stage, you might find that you learned a lot that you would have previously missed. So the next time you finish something quite thought-provoking, maybe give that a try. And just for the record, because this is really important, I'm not handing you any of this advice as homework. I don't expect you to apply everything and make it so slow that you cripple yourself. We all like different speeds and different levels of thoroughness. And just because there's a hardcore philosophy fan who spends a whole year on a single book doesn't mean you have to do the same. And it's up to you to decide the speed and how you approach each book. And regardless of what I say in this video, do what works best for you, whether that's nothing or everything. And that's important to mention because this final approach is so high effort, it's a hobby in itself. You create content about what you read. Video essays, threads, articles, reviews, absolutely anything you desire. And if you're wondering what that looks like in practice, it's this. It's what I'm doing now. A small part of why I make videos is so that I can better understand the things I talk about myself. When I first sit down to write a script or an article, I realize just how messy my thinking is. It's waffle, it's gibberish, dare I say, is gobbledygook. But through that process of creation, I polish up what I mean to say, I fill in the gaps, and at the end of it, I understand the topic more. It's the Feynman technique in action. You teach what you learn so that you can better understand it. And that simple principle has produced some of the greatest minds in history. Many famous scholars, professors, and philosophers were also teachers, and they use that technique to add friction to their learning and become experts in the field, so much so that we remember them hundreds of years later. And because of the internet, it's free for you to exploit literally right this second. We have no idea how lucky we are. It takes a while, but it's so worth it. Because it's one thing to read and write about a subject, and a totally different story to actually teach it. And if you ever had to teach an 8-year-old something, then you know exactly what I mean. Because you can have this really obvious, kind of self explanatory idea, but as soon as you try and communicate it in simple terms, you fall flat and you have no idea what to say. And it's kind of embarrassing, honestly. And that proves just how important it is not only to read about a subject, but to practice how you think and articulate yourself. Producing content on what you learn is the most logical path to getting there. You choose a topic that excites you, you learn about it, and then you share your own perspective with people who are equally hungry for it. And you might be thinking, well, who cares what I have to say? And you'd be surprised because you and I both watch YouTube. And whenever we scroll on videos and click on the ones we're interested in, we're hearing people share their perspective on a topic. And they're not demigods or sages, they're just ordinary people like you or me. And if their thoughts are worthy of attention, then why can't yours be? I'm not saying you have to be like them, but there's people out there who have built massive audiences literally just reading books and then sharing what they learn. So when you produce content about a topic you love, not only are you serving other people on a common path, but you're understanding it better yourself. And now, of course, this is where I plug the newsletter. I send weekly emails on reading, writing, learning, and all these other little tidbits of information that you may not see on the channel. So I'd really appreciate if you subscribe with the link below. It's totally free, of course, so I'll see you there. So all of that is how I add friction to my learning. I make it slower, but more effective. And I'm not saying I apply every single technique to every single book I read or video I watch, but the point is it helps me slow down the flow of information and to really digest the ideas more effectively. I hope they can inspire you in your own learning. And as always, I love to hear how you do it, how you make your learning slower and more careful. So my emails are open, the comments are open. Feel free to send me a message. And as always, thank you for watching.